The shuttle descended through orange clouds, and Daniel Cole pressed his face against the window like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below him stretched the capital city of Prime, a maze of crystal spires and floating platforms that made Earth's greatest cities look like mud huts. He had studied images of this place for months, but nothing had prepared him for the real thing. The Empire ruled 40 star systems, and there showed it. Every building seemed to glow from within, and the sky was filled with thousands of their kind, flying between towers on delicate wings that caught the light of two suns. Daniel was 32 years old and had spent the last decade working his way up through Earth's diplomatic corps. He spoke 6 human languages and 3 alien ones. He had served on stations at the edge of known space and negotiated trade deals with species that considered humans barely worth talking to. None of it had prepared him for this assignment. He was going to live in the royal palace of the most powerful empire humanity had ever encountered. He was going to represent his species to beings who had been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves. The shuttle landed on a platform made of something that looked like glass but felt solid as steel beneath his feet. A group of waited for him, and Daniel took a moment to study them. They stood nearly 7 feet tall with bodies covered in hard shells that ranged from deep purple to shimmering gold. Their faces were alien in every way, with large compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. Delicate wings folded against their backs, and their forearms moved with a grace that seemed almost like dancing. They were beautiful in a way that was hard to describe and terrifying in a way that was easy to understand. Commander Lisa Perry stepped forward to greet him. She was a tall woman with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She had been stationed here for 3 years and was the highest-ranking human on the planet. She shook his hand firmly and told him to follow her. There would be time for wonder later. Right now, he needed to learn the rules that would keep him alive. The palace was even more impressive up close. It rose from the center of the city like a mountain made of light, and the walls seemed to shift colors as Daniel walked past them. Perry explained that humans were guests here and nothing more. They were tolerated because Queen had pushed for opening relations with younger species. Many disagreed with this decision. They saw humans as primitives from a death world and could not understand why their queen would lower herself to speak with such creatures. Daniel would need to be careful. Every word he spoke and every move he made would be judged. There were only 6 humans allowed inside the palace, and each had a specific role. Daniel was a cultural liaison, which meant his job was to learn everything he could about customs and help smooth over any misunderstandings between their peoples. It sounded simple, but Perry warned him that it was anything but. They had thousands of years of tradition, and breaking even a small rule could cause serious problems. Humans had already made enemies among the traditionalist factions just by existing. Daniel could not afford to give them more reasons to hate his kind. His quarters were small but comfortable, a bed that adjusted to his body temperature and a window that looked out over the endless city. He spent his first night reading everything he could find about Queen. She had ruled for over 200 years and was considered young by standards. Her mother had been a warrior queen who had conquered 3 systems during her reign. Was different. She spoke of peace and cooperation. She believed they had grown stagnant in their isolation and needed fresh perspectives from other species. This made her popular among the younger, but hated by the old guard who remembered the glory days of expansion and conquest. Daniel began his duties the next morning. He attended ceremonies and meetings and learned to bow at the right moments and speak only when spoken to. Most ignored him completely. A few looked at him with curiosity, like he was an interesting animal they had never seen before. Only the servants treated him with anything close to kindness, and even they kept their distance. He was human, and that meant he was beneath notice. A week passed, and Daniel started to notice things that troubled him. The Queen's personal guards were called the Crimson Veil, and they were supposed to be the most elite warriors in the Empire. They wore red armor that seemed to drink in light and carried weapons that could cut through steel like paper, But Daniel watched them during ceremonies, and something felt wrong. They were not as attentive as they should be. Their eyes wandered when they should have been locked on potential threats. Some of them whispered to each other at moments, when protocol demanded silence. He mentioned this to Commander Perry during one of their weekly meetings. She listened patiently, and then told him he was being paranoid. The Crimson Veil had protected royalty for thousands of years. They were chosen from birth and trained from childhood. Their loyalty was beyond question. Daniel was seeing problems where none existed because he was new and nervous. She told him to focus on his actual job and stop looking for conspiracies. Daniel tried to follow her advice, but he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He began studying the language more deeply than his assignment required. He learned the subtle differences between formal speech and casual conversation. He learned to read their body language and the meaning behind different patterns of wing movement. And he listened. He listened whenever he could without being noticed. 3 weeks into his assignment, he was walking through a corridor late at night when he heard voices coming from behind a closed door, two speaking in low tones that were meant not to be heard. Daniel pressed himself against the wall and held his breath. His heart pounded so hard he was sure they would hear it. The voices spoke of something called the cleansing. They spoke of restoration and the old ways. They spoke of a queen who had forgotten her duty to her people and needed to be reminded. One voice said the festival of Ascension would be the perfect time. The other agreed. Daniel did not understand everything they said, but he understood enough. The queen's own guards were planning to kill her. He stood frozen in that dark corridor as the truth settled into his bones like ice. The most powerful empire in the galaxy was about to lose its leader, and humanity would be blamed for it. He was sure of that last part. Why else would they allow humans into the palace? They needed someone to take the fall. He walked back to his quarters on shaking legs and did not sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling and wondered what he was supposed to do with knowledge that could change the fate of two civilizations. Daniel went to Commander Perry first thing in the morning. He told her everything he had heard and watched her face change from annoyance to concern to something that looked like fear. She made him repeat every word twice and then sat in silence for a long moment. This was serious, more serious than anything she had dealt with during her 3 years on Prime. But she was also cautious. Accusing the Queen's own guards of treason without solid proof would be a disaster. It could destroy everything humanity had worked toward. It could start a war. She told Daniel he needed evidence, something concrete that she could take to the authorities without looking like a fool or a troublemaker. The Festival of Ascension was in 3 days. He had that long to find what they needed. She would do what she could from her end, but her movements were watched more closely than his. Daniel was low-ranking enough to go places she could not. Daniel spent that day trying to get an audience with Queen herself. He filed requests through proper channels and spoke to every official who would listen. None of it worked. Humans were considered too lowly to speak directly with royalty. The very idea seemed to amuse the bureaucrats he approached. One of them laughed and asked if Daniel also wanted an audience with the 2 suns in the sky. Another told him to remember his place and be grateful he was allowed inside the palace at all. Desperate for any ally he could find, Daniel approached Prince. The Queen's eldest offspring was known to be more open-minded than most nobles and had actually spoken to humans on several occasions. Daniel found him in one of the garden chambers and bowed as deeply as protocol required. He explained that he had information about a threat to the Queen's life and begged the prince to listen. Studied him with those alien eyes that revealed nothing. Then he made a sound that Daniel had learned was the equivalent of a dismissive snort. Humans were paranoid creatures, he said. They came from a world where everything was trying to kill them, and they saw threats in every shadow. The Crimson Veil had protected his family for generations beyond counting. To suggest they would harm the Queen was an insult to their honor and to his. He told Daniel to stop wasting his time and walked away without looking back. Daniel stood alone in that garden, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. He was a stranger in a world that did not want him. He had knowledge that no one would believe, and time was running out. That evening he sat in the palace kitchens because it was one of the few places where he felt almost welcome. The servants who worked there were curious about humans in a way that others were not. They asked him questions about Earth and what humans ate and how they lived without wings. One servant in particular had been kind to him since his first day. Her name was, and she was young by standards with a shell that shimmered between blue and green depending on the light. She brought him food that had been prepared specially for human digestion and sat with him while he ate. Tonight he must have looked worse than usual because she asked him what was wrong. He hesitated for a long moment. Trusting anyone was a risk, but he had run out of options. He told her what he had heard and what he feared. He expected her to dismiss him the way everyone else had. Instead, she went very still. Her wings twitched in a pattern he had learned meant deep concern. She told him that she had noticed strange things too. Guards meeting in places they should not be. Whispered conversations that stopped whenever she came near. She had thought she was imagining things. Servants were not supposed to notice such things and certainly not supposed to speak of them. But if a human had seen the same patterns, then perhaps neither of them was wrong. They began investigating together. Knew the palace in ways that Daniel never could. She knew the hidden passages that servants used and the schedules of every guard. She knew which nobles met with which generals and what gifts had been exchanged. Daniel contributed his outsider perspective and his training in reading people. Together, they began to piece together a picture that was even worse than he had feared. The conspiracy went far beyond the Crimson Veil. High-ranking nobles were involved, and military commanders, and even members of the royal court who smiled at the queen during the day and plotted her death at night. The leader of it all was a general named. He was a war hero who had fought in campaigns that had expanded the empire's borders decades ago. He was old and respected, and believed with all his heart that Queen was destroying everything that had built. Her openness to other species was a poison, he said. Her talk of cooperation was weakness. The empire needed a strong ruler who would restore the old ways and remind the galaxy why they should fear the plan to kill the queen during the Festival of Ascension. The festival was a sacred ceremony that happened once every decade. The queen would appear before thousands of her subjects and receive the blessing of the ancestors. It was a moment of deep religious significance and also the perfect opportunity for assassination. Security would be focused on the crowd, not on the guards standing beside the throne. Daniel and discovered the method 2 nights before the festival. They found documents hidden in a storage room that knew was used by the conspirators. The traditional ceremony included a blessing of arrows. 12 ceremonial crossbows would be fired toward the sky, and the queen would catch the blessed arrows and return them to the earth. It was symbolic, and the arrows were supposed to be blunted and harmless. But the documents showed that the crossbows had been modified. The arrows would be real and sharp and tipped with poison. They would be aimed not at the sky, but at the queen. And when she fell, the conspirators would claim that human agents had somehow interfered with the ceremony. The 6 humans in the palace would be executed, and any hope of alliance between their peoples would die with them. Daniel stared at those documents and felt the weight of 2 civilizations pressing down on his shoulders. He had the evidence now. But Commander Perry was off-planet attending negotiations on a nearby moon. He could not reach her in time. The festival was tomorrow, and he was alone with the truth. Looked at him and asked what they were going to do. He wished he had an answer. Daniel sat alone in his quarters as the night grew deep. The documents were spread across his bed, and he read them again, and again hoping he had missed something. Some detail that would tell him how to stop what was coming without getting himself killed. But there was nothing. The conspiracy was too well planned and too well hidden. By the time he could reach anyone with the authority to act, the queen would already be dead. He thought about doing nothing. It was the safe choice, the smart choice. He could claim ignorance when the assassination happened and let them deal with their own problems. Humanity might still be blamed, but perhaps some of them would survive. Perhaps the truth would come out eventually and his people would be cleared. It was a small hope, but it was something. But then he thought about what would happen if he stayed silent. The queen would die. A woman who had done nothing wrong except believe that different species could live together in peace. The conspirators would take power and the empire would turn inward and hostile. War would come eventually. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And Daniel would spend the rest of his life knowing he could have stopped it. He thought about his sister back on Earth. She was 5 years younger than him and had always looked up to him even when he did not deserve it. She had cried when he left for this assignment and made him promise to come home safe. He had promised without really thinking about what that promise meant. Now he understood. Going home safe meant walking away from this. It meant letting evil win because fighting it was too hard. He picked up his communicator and recorded a message for her. He told her that he loved her and that he was proud of the woman she had become. He told her that if she was watching this, it meant he had done something stupid and brave, and he hoped she would understand why. He told her not to be sad for too long because he had always known this was how his story might end. Then he deleted the message because it felt too much like giving up, and he was not ready to give up yet. The night passed slowly. Daniel did not sleep. He paced his small room and looked out at the city lights and tried to think of another way. There had to be something he could do that did not involve throwing his life away on a gamble that probably would not work. Dawn came and he still had no better plan. The festival would begin in 6 hours. Queen would stand before her people and receive the blessing that was meant to kill her. And Daniel would either act or he would watch from a distance and live with the consequences forever. He made his choice. Met him in the servants' corridors as the sun rose higher. She had been awake all night too, and her wings hung low with exhaustion. But she had done what he asked. She had found ceremonial robes that would allow him to stand near the queen during the blessing. They were meant for a minor official who was sick and would not be attending. The robes were too large for a human body, but had altered them through the night to fit him well enough. She helped him dress and showed him how to hold himself so that he looked like he belonged. She taught him the words he would need to say if anyone questioned him. She did everything she could to give him a chance even though she knew what he was planning. When he was ready, she looked at him with those alien eyes that had become familiar over the past weeks. She asked him if he was sure about this. He was human and weak and had no weapons. He was going to stand in front of arrows meant for a queen he barely knew. The odds of survival were almost zero. Daniel told her he was sure. He had thought about it all night and he understood what he was doing. Humans came from a world that wanted to kill them. They had evolved surrounded by predators and poisons and disasters, but they had survived because they learned to protect each other. They learned that sometimes one person had to stand in front of danger so that others could live. It was written into their blood and their bones and their history. He could not walk away from this any more than he could stop breathing. Was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him something that surprised him. She said that when humans first came to Prime, they had laughed at them. Such small creatures with no shells and no wings and no natural weapons. How had they ever survived on their death world? How had they built ships that crossed the stars? Now she understood. Humans were not strong because of their bodies. They were strong because of something inside them that they had never seen before. A willingness to sacrifice that went beyond logic or self-preservation. She said it was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. She said she was honored to have known him even for such a short while. Daniel thanked her for everything she had done. He asked her to stay away from the ceremony today. Whatever happened, she did not deserve to be caught up in it. She was young and had a long life ahead of her. She should not throw that away for a human who was about to do something foolish. She told him she would do as he asked, but she also told him that if he survived, she expected him to buy her dinner. It was a human custom she had read about, and she wanted to experience it. Daniel laughed for the first time in days and promised he would. Then he walked out into the palace corridors and made his way toward the ceremonial plaza. The sun was high and hot, and thousands were already gathering. Their wings filled the air with a humming sound that was almost like music. They had no idea what was coming. They were there to celebrate their queen and receive her blessing, and none of them suspected that some of their own people planned to turn this sacred day into a massacre. Daniel found his place at the edge of the royal platform. He could see the ceremonial archers taking their positions. He could see General watching from the shadows with satisfaction on his alien face, and he could see the queen emerging from the palace in her white ceremonial robes. She was beautiful in a way that transcended species. She moved with grace and dignity, and her people loved her. He could see it in the way they looked at her. He was going to protect her or die trying. There was no other choice left. The Festival of Ascension was the most magnificent thing Daniel had ever witnessed. The ceremonial plaza stretched before him like an ocean of bodies and light. Tens of thousands of filled every available space, and their wings created a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Floating platforms carried nobles and dignitaries above the crowd. Banners of crimson and gold hung from every surface and caught the light of the twin suns. It was beautiful and sacred, and Daniel was probably going to die here. He stood at the edge of the royal platform in his borrowed robes. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard he was surprised no one could hear it. He was surrounded by guards and officials who paid him no attention. He was just another minor figure in a ceremony that had been performed the same way for thousands of years. None of them suspected that anything was wrong. Queen emerged from the palace, and the crowd fell silent. She floated on a throne of crystal that glowed with inner light, and her white ceremonial robes flowed behind her like water. Her shell had been polished until it shone like gold, and jewels hung from her wings. She was the heart of the empire, and every eye in the plaza was fixed on her. Daniel watched the ceremonial archers take their final positions. There were 12 of them standing in a semicircle before the throne. They wore the red armor of the crimson veil, and their crossbows were raised toward the sky. In a normal ceremony, they would fire their blessed arrows into the air, and the queen would catch them and return them to the earth. It was symbolic, a reminder that she stood between heaven and her people. But today the arrows were not symbolic. Today they were real and sharp and poisoned, and the archers were not going to aim at the sky. The high priest began chanting in the ancient language. His voice echoed across the plaza, and the crowd responded with words that had been spoken at this ceremony for generations beyond counting. Daniel did not understand all of it, but he felt the weight of tradition pressing down on everyone present. This was sacred to them. This was the most important moment in a decade, and it was about to become a nightmare. He watched the lead archer, a tall with a shell so dark it was almost black. His eyes were fixed on the queen, and his mandibles moved slightly as if he was counting down to something. Daniel had studied body language long enough to know what he was seeing. The archer was preparing himself, steeling his nerves for what he was about to do. The chanting reached its peak. The crowd held their breath. The archers raised their crossbows higher, and Daniel saw the moment the lead archer shifted his aim. The angle changed just slightly. Instead of pointing at the sky, the crossbow was now aimed at the queen's chest. Daniel moved. He did not think. There was no time to think. His body acted on instinct and training and something deeper than either. He threw himself forward and crossed the distance between his position and the queen in a heartbeat. He heard shouting behind him. He heard the snap of crossbow strings releasing. He felt the wind of arrows cutting through the air. 3 of them hit him. The first struck his shoulder and spun him half around. The second buried itself in his chest just below his heart. The third punched through his abdomen, and he felt something inside him tear. Pain exploded through his body like fire, and he fell against the queen's throne. His blood splattered across her white robes, red against white, human against. The most shocking image anyone in that plaza had ever seen. Queen stared down at him. Her compound eyes were wide with something that might have been shock or confusion or both. A human had thrown himself between her and death, a creature she had never spoken to, a being from a species she barely knew. He was bleeding out at her feet and she did not understand why. The plaza erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward with weapons drawn. The crowd screamed and pushed and tried to flee. The conspirators among the archers tried to run, but other guards were already moving to stop them. No one knew what was happening. No one understood what they had just witnessed. Daniel was dying. He could feel it. The poison on the arrows was burning through his veins and the world was starting to go gray at the edges. But he was not dead yet, and he had one more thing to do. He raised his hand and pointed at General, who was trying to slip away through a side passage. His voice came out weak and broken, but he forced the words through his lips in the language he had worked so hard to learn. He ordered them to kill you, the General. The arrows were for your heart. The words carried across the platform. Guards turned to look at. The General froze with guilt written across his alien face. For a moment no one moved. The crimson veil stood torn between their loyalty to their commander and the evidence dying at their queen's feet. Some of them reached for their weapons. Others stepped back in confusion. Then Queen spoke. Her voice rang out clear and cold and full of authority that silenced everyone who heard it. She commanded the guards to seize General and everyone who had been standing with him. She commanded the plaza to be sealed. No one was to leave until she understood what had happened here. The loyal guards moved, tried to fight, but there were too many of them. The conspirators among the archers threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Within minutes, the assassination plot was unraveling as guards dragged away everyone who had been part of it. Daniel saw none of this. He was lying in a pool of his own blood with his vision fading to black. The last thing he felt was something touching his head. The queen had descended from her throne and was cradling him like a child. Her hands were gentle on his face, and her voice was saying something he could not quite hear. Then there was nothing at all. Daniel opened his eyes and saw light, soft blue light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. He was lying on something warm and his body felt strange, heavy and distant as if it belonged to someone else. For a long moment he did not know where he was or how he had gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back. The festival, the arrows, the blood. He tried to sit up and pain shot through his chest so intense that it stole his breath. A hand pressed him back down and he heard a familiar voice telling him to stay still. Commander Perry was sitting beside him. Her face was tired and her eyes were red, but she was smiling. She told him he had been unconscious for 3 days. The healers had worked on him around the clock using medical technology far beyond anything humans possessed. The arrows had been poisoned with something designed to kill instantly. It should have killed him too, but human physiology was strange to the galaxy. His immune system had fought the poison just long enough for the healers to intervene. They said they had never seen anything like it. They said he should be dead 10 times over. Daniel asked about the queen. Perry told him she was alive and unharmed thanks to him. The conspiracy had been exposed, and 17 of its members had been executed, including General. The Crimson Veil had been disbanded and reformed under new leadership. The entire empire was in shock. Nothing like this had happened in recorded history. And at the center of it all was a human who had thrown his body between their queen and death. Perry was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that what he had done was reckless and insubordinate and completely unauthorized. She should have him court-martialed and sent back to Earth in disgrace. Instead, she was recommending him for the highest honor humanity could give. He had saved more than the queen. He had saved the relationship between their peoples. He had changed everything. Over the next few days, Daniel recovered slowly. The healers checked on him constantly and treated him with a respect that was completely different from how they had treated him before. Word had spread through the palace about what he had done. Servants who had ignored him now bowed when he passed. Guards who had looked through him now nodded with something like admiration. He was no longer an invisible human. He was the one who had bled for their queen. A week after the festival, he was summoned to the throne room. He walked slowly because his wounds still ached with every step. The great doors opened before him, and he saw Queen waiting on her crystal throne. The room was filled with nobles and officials and guards, all of them watching him, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel approached the throne and bowed as deeply as his injured body would allow. He expected a formal acknowledgement, perhaps a medal or some kind of diplomatic recognition, something appropriate for the occasion that would be recorded in history and then forgotten. Instead, the queen rose from her throne and descended the steps toward him. Every in the room gasped. No monarch had done this for a lesser species in living memory. It was simply not done. The queen was divine, and those below her waited for her attention. They did not receive it this way. But Queen did not seem to care about tradition in this moment. She walked until she stood directly in front of Daniel, close enough that he could see the patterns on her shell and the depths of her compound eyes. She studied him for a long moment, and then she asked him a question. "Why did you do it? You owed me nothing. Your species owed me nothing. You could have let me die and no one would have blamed you. Why did you bleed for me?" Daniel thought about the question. He had asked himself the same thing during those long hours of recovery. What had driven him to throw himself in front of those arrows? Fear of what would happen if the queen died. Some kind of political calculation about the future of human relations. Neither of those explanations felt true. He told her the real answer. He said that it was the right thing to do. He said that humans came from a hard world where survival was never guaranteed. They had learned long ago that protecting each other was the only way to make it through. When he saw danger coming for her, something inside him had refused to stand aside. It did not matter that she was alien. It did not matter that they had never spoken. She was someone who needed protection, and he was someone who could provide it. That was enough. The queen was silent. Her wings moved in a pattern Daniel had never seen before. Something between wonder and sadness and respect all mixed together. Then she did something that would be discussed in history texts for centuries. She bowed to him. The room erupted in whispers. Nobles who had lived their entire lives seeing humans as inferior creatures stared in disbelief. Guards who had dismissed Daniel as weak and unimportant now looked at him with new eyes. The queen of the most powerful empire in the galaxy had just bowed to a human. She raised her head and spoke so that everyone could hear. She said that the empire had underestimated humanity. They had seen humans as primitives from a harsh world, too young and too savage to matter in the grand scheme of things. They had been wrong. A species that produced individuals willing to die for strangers was not primitive. It was something far more dangerous and far more valuable. She declared that from this day forward humanity would be a protected friend of the Empire. Any who harmed them would face the full wrath of the 40 systems. Any who threatened them would answer to her personally. And Daniel Cole would be remembered as the human who taught that true courage was not measured in strength, but in sacrifice. That evening, Daniel stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The twin suns were setting, and the sky burned with colors that had no names in any human language. His wounds still ached, but he was alive. He had expected to die, and instead he was watching the beginning of something new. Joined him on the balcony. She had been promoted for her role in exposing the conspiracy and now wore robes that marked her as a member of the Queen's personal staff. She stood beside him and watched the sunset without speaking. Finally, she reminded him that he owed her dinner. He had promised, and humans always kept their promises. At least that was what she had heard. Daniel laughed. It hurt his chest, but he did not care. He told her that he would buy her the finest dinner on Prime as soon as he could walk without limping. She said she would hold him to that. Below them, the city was changing. Human ships would arrive soon in greater numbers than ever before. Trade agreements would be signed. Embassies would open. Two species that had once looked at each other with suspicion would begin building something together. It would not be easy. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings and probably more conspiracies. But the foundation had been laid in blood and sacrifice, and it would hold. Daniel carried scars now that would never fully heal. He had paid for this moment with pieces of himself that he would never get back. But as he watched the two suns sink below the horizon and felt the warm evening air on his face, he knew it had been worth every drop of blood. The queen had been targeted, and he had stood in front of the arrows. He had paid the price that needed to be paid. And in doing so, he had proven something that the galaxy had never understood about his kind. Humans protect those who need protecting, even when it costs them everything, even when no one would blame them for walking away. That was what made them dangerous. That was what made them valuable. That was what made them human.